Hello, and welcome to part one of two, where we will be talking about what it means to be a trauma-informed organization. Part one is really focused on understanding what trauma is and how it impacts the brain and behavior. I'm Elise from OK So, and I want to really thank you for taking the time to learn about this. It is such a crucial piece of the work that we're doing with young people, and it can really apply actually to many people in our lives. Today is going to be fairly short and sweet, and then we encourage you to take what you've learned here and also watch part two to really put it all together. Right now, we're going to be talking about the brain generally and how it fits into brain development. Then we'll talk about what trauma is and how it impacts the brain. We'll look at the types of behaviors that we see from folks who have experienced trauma, and then we'll have some time, of course, to apply this to your work. Hopefully, you have already watched our training on adolescent brain development, so you have a sense of what's happening. But to summarize, a typical adolescent brain is really sort of moving back and forth between the more emotional and the more rational parts of the brain. And it's generally more excited by rewards than consequences. And it's really still developing. So if you have the privilege of knowing a young person for several years, what you may notice is how their thinking or their behavior changes. Because young people's brains are still developing, this means that sometimes we might be setting an expectation or asking them to do something that their brain physically cannot do. So as we've seen before, many of these developmental pieces are really not done until the early to mid 20s. So whether it's clients or employees, folks who are on the younger side really still have developing brains. So let's talk about typical brain development. You may already know a lot of this, but I want to make sure that we're all on the same page as we move into talking about brains that have experienced trauma. So you may have noticed that a typical brain is growing and it's changing. It's what we call a learning brain. So why do we call it a learning brain? Take a minute on your worksheet and do some brainstorming. When you hear the phrase learning brain, what are some of the things that a learning brain might be able to do or ways that it might think? So take a second. You can pause this video if you want to do some brainstorming and then come back. And of course, as we go through these, you can feel free to fill them out on your worksheet. So one characteristic of the learning brain is that, not surprisingly, it is open to learning new information. This might sound simple, but actually, if you look at people in your life, there are probably people you know who actually are really not open to learning new information. People whose first response to new information is to get defensive or to deny it or to stop listening. Learning brains are also okay with ambiguity, and this is a huge thing. We live in a world where, let's be real, most things are not black and white. And being able to really kind of sit with gray areas is actually really hard for a lot of people. We see it all over the place. Learning brains are really also able to take a step back from the details and see something bigger, a way that they connect to others or the larger goal they're trying to reach, or just how many more things are at play than maybe just this situation. There are a lot of ways that this can show up. Learning brains also tend to spend most of their time in a state of calm. They're curious, they're able to be playful or silly, they experience excitement and joy. I really love this one so much. So learning brains are not afraid of making a mistake. This is, of course, a generalization, and all of us experience times when we're afraid of making a mistake, but we can engage with the process of making a mistake. And part of the reason that we can do this is that learning brains understand that we can learn and change. You've probably heard growth mindset. So learning brains are really sort of much more easily wired towards that growth mindset. So what are we sort of contrasting this with? Let's look at trauma and its impact on the brain. So First, let's talk about what trauma actually is. On your worksheet, we'd love you to take a moment and complete this sentence. Of course, pause the video if you need to. Trauma is. How would you define trauma? So here's how we define trauma. It's a sort of multi-part definition. So first, trauma is emotionally painful or distressing experiences. This can mean physical too, but the emotional component is really key. So emotionally painful and distressing experiences that overwhelm someone's ability to cope. So this means that two people might experience very similar or the same event, and one person might find it traumatic while the other person doesn't. And this is because, for whatever reason, it's exceeding one of those people's ability to cope. Lastly, it leaves them feeling powerless. Again, this really differs for different people, but generally, some amount of time feeling powerless is part of experiencing trauma. So, what can we conclude from this definition? I think one thing to really keep in mind is that trauma is a highly emotional and a highly personal experience. It's not going to be the same for everyone. So, what is actually happening when someone experiences any traumatic event? This could be anything from an accident, a natural disaster, to abuse in the home. There are lots of different things that can be going on. When a traumatic event happens, we're probably familiar with this, you've heard of this. The brain goes into fight, flight, freeze mode. We really don't have any control over this. It just happens. It's coming from that kind of limbic system of our brain. We don't even have control over whether our brain picks fight, flight, or freeze. That just happens too. And so what is really going on is that our brain is dropping down into its lower functions. The higher logical reasoning parts of our brain just go offline, and the instinctual emotional parts really take over. So all of us have experienced traumatic incidents when our brain goes into this kind of fight, flight, freeze place. And generally that happens for a short amount of time, and then our brain returns to its typical functioning. But what if this happens more than once, especially during childhood? And what if this happens more than once during childhood when a kid is young enough not to have any idea what is happening? And what if it happens with someone that they are hardwired to love and care about, and who is supposed to keep them safe? So what we see then is that the brain sort of gets trapped in the fight, flight, freeze survival mode. And it spends more and more of its time there. And so it sort of gets used to being there. And that becomes its new reality. So when this can happen, what we start to see is really more permanent changes in the brain. So instead of a brain that's focused on learning and growth, we have a brain focused and wired around survival. So what does this actually look like?